July 12, 1945, Fort Des Moines, Iowa. The morning sun blazed across the parade ground with the kind of intensity that turns asphalt into a shimmering mirage. Heat rose in visible waves from the tarmac where 37 German women stood at attention, their prisoner uniforms grey cotton dresses marked with POW stenciled across the back already darkening with sweat at the collar and underarms. They had been told to assemble at 060 hours. They had been told nothing else. In the distance, the crack of rifle fire echoed across the flat Iowa landscape, sharp and precise. Each shot separated by exactly 3 seconds. The rhythm of training, of discipline, of something these women thought they understood until they saw who was holding the weapons. Across the firing range, a formation of American women in khaki uniforms moved with the fluid coordination of a mechanism. Designed for a single purpose, they wore their hair pinned back beneath garrison caps. Their boots were polished to a mirror shine despite the dust. On their sleeves, the insignia of the Women's Army Corps, the WAC, a division of the United States military that the German prisoners had been assured did not exist in any meaningful capacity. Women, they had been taught, were not warriors. Women were mothers, nurses, supporters of men who fought. Women did not carry rifles. Women did not train for combat. Women certainly did not shoot with the kind of cold precision that was currently putting rounds through paper targets at 200 yards with a consistency that made the German prisoners exchange glances of confusion and something approaching disbelief. Oberofficer in Engel, 41 years old, former supervisor of a Luftwaffe communications center in Frankfurt, watched the American women reload their M1 Garand rifles with movements so practiced they seemed mechanical. She had served in the auxiliary forces for 3 years, had worn a uniform, had given orders to subordinates, had believed herself to be part of a military machine that represented the pinnacle of German organizational excellence. She had never fired a weapon, not once. Her training had consisted of radio operation, typing, filing, the administrative machinery that kept airfields functioning. The closest she had come to combat was listening to radio traffic from pilots who often did not return, their voices cutting out mid-transmission, leaving only static where men had been moments before. Now she watched American women girls, really. Some of them barely 20-handle weapons with a casualness that suggested firearms were as natural as typewriters, as ordinary as kitchen utensils. One of them, a corporal with red hair escaping from beneath her cap, field stripped her rifle in less than 30 seconds, laying out the components on a canvas top with the same efficiency Hild had once used to organize paperwork. The corporal's hands moved without hesitation, checking each piece for wear, for obstruction, for any sign of malfunction. Then she reassembled it, the metal pieces clicking together with the sound of precision engineering, and loaded a fresh clip with 8 rounds that slid into place with a satisfying metallic snap. The German women said nothing. They had learned, over the past 4 months of captivity, that silence was safer than questions, that observation revealed more than interrogation. They had learned that America was not what they had been told, that every assumption they had carried across the Atlantic in the cargo holds of prison ships had been systematically dismantled by the simple fact of American reality. But this watching women soldier with the competence of professionals, this required a recalibration so fundamental that Hild could feel something shifting in her understanding of the world. A tectonic movement of ideology that threatened to crack the foundation of everything she had believed about gender, about capability, about the natural order of things. The women of Fort Des Moines had been captured in the final chaotic months of the European War, plucked from the wreckage of a Germany that was collapsing faster than even Allied intelligence had predicted. They were not frontline soldiers. The Wehrmacht had never formally deployed women in combat roles, though desperation in the war's final year had blurred many previously firm boundaries. They were Nachrichtenhilfen, communication auxiliaries, Luftwaffenhelfen, Air Force assistants, Stabschauffeuren, staff helpers. They had operated switchboards, decoded messages, tracked aircraft movements, typed orders, maintained records. They had been essential to the war effort in the same way that infrastructure is essential. Invisible until it stops working, undervalued until it is gone. Many had volunteered in 1942 and 1943, when Germany still seemed capable of victory. When the propaganda machinery painted service as patriotic duty and the uniforms carried a certain glamour, a suggestion of modernity, and participation in something historically significant, they had been promised that their work would free men for combat duty, that their contribution would be valued, that they would be part of the 1,000-year Reich's administrative backbone. What they had not been promised, what no one had thought to mention, was what would happen when the Reich collapsed in less than 12 years, when the cities they had served in became rubble, when the army they had supported surrendered unconditionally, when they became prisoners of a nation they had been taught to view with contempt. The transport to America had been its own form of education. Crammed into the holds of Liberty ships, they had crossed an Atlantic that German U-boats no longer controlled, passing through waters where American naval power was so overwhelming that the voyage felt less like a military operation and more like a ferry service. They had expected brutality, or at minimum, harsh treatment. Instead, they received medical examinations, delousing, clean uniforms, and 3 meals a day that contained more calories than many of them had seen in years. The cognitive dissonance had been crushing. Fort Des Moines had been established as a WAC training center in 1942, the first facility dedicated to training women for military service. By 1945, thousands of women had passed through its barracks and classrooms, learning everything from clerical work to motor pool maintenance, from cryptography to military police procedures. The fort had also become a processing center for female prisoners of war, a designation that created administrative headaches for a military bureaucracy that had not anticipated capturing significant numbers of enemy women. The solution was pragmatic: house them in a separate compound, assign female guards from the WAC, and figure out the details as situations arose. What no one had anticipated was that proximity would create its own dynamics. That American and German women, separated by war and ideology, but united by the simple fact of gender in a male-dominated institution, would begin to observe each other with a fascination that transcended enmity. The shooting demonstration had been Captain Dorothy Hetherington's idea. She was 32, a former schoolteacher from Oregon, who had enlisted in 1943 and discovered a talent for marksmanship that had earned her a position as a firearms instructor. She had trained hundreds of WAC recruits in the basics of rifle operation, not because the military expected women to serve in combat. Official policy still prohibited it, but because competence with weapons was considered part of military discipline, and discipline was what transformed civilians into soldiers. She had noticed the German prisoners watching the rifle range with expressions that oscillated between confusion and something approaching you. Anger. Not for violence, but for understanding. They watched the way other prisoners might watch films of home, with an intensity that suggested they were trying to decode meaning from every gesture, every movement. They look like they want to learn. Captain Hetherington had mentioned to Colonel Patricia Mason, the fort's administrative commander, over coffee in the officers' mess. The German women. They watch our recruits shoot like they're watching magic tricks. Colonel Mason, a veteran of WAC administration, who had fought bureaucratic battles to establish women's roles in the military, considered this. The Wehrmacht didn't train their auxiliaries with weapons, she said. Different philosophy. Women were support staff, not soldiers. Even in auxiliary roles, they drew a harder line than we do. Think there's value in showing them the difference. Value? Mason smiled slightly. Probably. The Geneva Convention requires we treat prisoners humanely. keep them productively occupied. Teaching them to shoot seems like it might violate about 17 regulations, but then again, we're not technically teaching them combat tactics, we're teaching them a skill. Same as teaching typing or engine repair. Is that a yes? That's a let's see what happens, and have paperwork ready to explain it later. So on July 12, 1945, -17 German prisoners were marched to the firing range and told they would be learning basic rifle marksmanship. The announcement had been delivered in German by Sergeant First Class Emma Rothstein, a Jewish émigré from Hamburg who had fled in 1938 and now served as the fort's primary translator. Her presence among the American ranks had been its own shock to the prisoners. A German Jew in American uniform, speaking with Berlin diction, alive and healthy when everything they had been told suggested such people should not exist anymore. You will be taught to shoot, Emma translated from Captain Hetherington's English. This is not combat training. You are prisoners, but the United States Army believes in useful skills. And marksmanship is useful. You will follow instructions. You will treat the weapons with respect. If you do not wish to participate, you may return to the barracks. No one will be forced. None of the women moved, whether from curiosity, from boredom, from some deeper need to understand the people who had defeated them. They stayed, all 37 of them, standing in formation under the Iowa sun, waiting to learn something that their own military had deemed unnecessary for women to know. The M1 Garand rifle weighed 9.5 pounds unloaded. It was a semi-automatic weapon, gas-operated, capable of firing 8 rounds before needing to be reloaded. It had been standard issue for American infantry since 1936, and General Patton had famously called it the greatest battle implement ever devised. In the hands of trained soldiers, it was lethal at ranges up to 500 yards. In the hands of WAC trainees at Fort Des Moines, it became something more complex, a symbol of capability, a refutation of the idea that women were fundamentally unsuited for the mechanics of warfare. Captain Hetherington began with the basics. She stood before the formation of German prisoners with a rifle held at port arms, her voice carrying across the range with the clarity of someone accustomed to being heard over wind and distance. Emma translated in real time, her German precise, and an accent, her face carefully neutral. This is the M1 Garand. It is a tool. Like any tool, it requires knowledge and respect. It is not magic. It is engineering. You will learn to hold it, to load it, to aim it, and to fire it. You will not be given live ammunition today. Today, you will learn the mechanics. The ammunition comes when you understand the weapon. Hetherington demonstrated the proper stance, feet shoulder width apart, weight balanced, left hand supporting the barrel, right hand on the grip, stock pressed firmly into the shoulder pocket. Her movements were economical, practiced, each position flowing into the next with the kind of fluidity that comes from endless repetition. She showed them how to sight down the barrel, how to align the front post with the rear aperture, how to control breathing to minimize movement, how to squeeze, never jerk the trigger, and the pause between exhales. The German women watched with an attention that bordered on reverence. Hilde Engel found herself memorizing each position, each instruction, not because she anticipated ever needing to shoot, but because the demonstration represented something she had never considered possible. That competence with weapons was not gendered, that the ability to kill efficiently was not exclusively male, that everything she had been taught about the natural order of warfare had been a lie designed to keep women in positions where they could be useful without being threatening. When Hetherington finished the demonstration, she nodded to the WAC corporals stationed along the firing line. Each of you will work with a partner. The corporals will give you unloaded rifles. You will practice the stance and the sight picture. No ammunition, just mechanics. The corporals distributed rifles with the efficiency of assembly line workers. Each German prisoner received a weapon and an American partner, a WAC trainee, who would correct their grip, adjust their stance, guide them through the foreign language of marksmanship. Hield was paired with a corporal named Susan Kowalski, a girl of perhaps 22 from Pittsburgh, whose hands moved with the confidence of someone who had grown up around firearms, who had probably learned to shoot from her father in the woods of Pennsylvania, for whom guns were as familiar as cutlery. "Here," Susan said, and Emma translated. "Hold it like this, firm, but not tense. The weapon should feel like an extension of your arms, not a separate object. If you're fighting it, you're doing it wrong." Hild adjusted her grip. The rifle was heavier than she had expected, the metal worn from the sun, the wood stock smooth and worn from countless hands. She pressed it into her shoulder, as Hetherington had demonstrated, feeling the weight settle into her body, changing her center of gravity, making her plant her feet more firmly to compensate. "Good," Susan said. "Now look down the sight. Close your left eye. See the front post, line it up with the center of the rear circle. Whatever the post points at, that's where the bullet goes. Simple geometry." Hild looked. The sight picture swam into focus, the world narrowing to a circle of clarity surrounded by blur, the front post sharp and unmistakable. She imagined the trajectory. The bullet leaving the barrel at 3,000 feet per second, the parabolic arc that physics demanded, the impact point where intention became reality. She had calculated trajectories before, for aircraft, for radio signals, abstract mathematics that described motion without consequence. This was different. This was personal. This was power condensed into 8 pounds of steel unwood, dormant, but ready, waiting for the squeeze of a finger to transform potential into kinetic energy. She lowered the rifle, her heart beating faster than the exertion warranted. "Why are you teaching us this?" she asked Susan through Emma's translation. "We are your prisoners. Why give us knowledge that could be used against you?" Susan looked at her with an expression that suggested the question was somehow missing the point. "Because you're going to go home eventually," she said. "And when you do, you should know that American women can do everything German women were told they couldn't. You should know that the difference between us isn't biology. It's just training. Anyone can learn to shoot. We did. Now you are. That's the whole point." The ideological chasm this opened was immense. National Socialist gender doctrine had been explicit. Women were mothers and homemakers, their biological destiny tied to children and kitchen. Their value measured in fertility rather than capability. The party had celebrated traditional femininity, had given medals to women who bore multiple children for the Reich, had restricted female education and employment in favor of domestic roles. Even women's auxiliary service had been framed as an extension of nurturing, supporting men, facilitating their work, never competing with them for roles that required physical strength or violence. And yet, here were American women who did both. They were soldiers and mothers, workers and wives, capable of tenderness and lethality, refusing the binary choice that German ideology had insisted was natural law. The WAC members at Fort Des Moines included married women with children in daycare facilities established by the military. They included college graduates who had put careers on hold to serve. They included women who had worked in factories building bombers, who had ferried aircraft across the Atlantic, who had served as military, police and code breakers and intelligence analysts. They had not abandoned femininity to gain these roles. They had simply rejected the premise that femininity and capability were mutually exclusive. For the German prisoners, raised in a system that had made gender roles central to national identity, this was destabilizing in ways that military defeat alone had not been. Losing a war could be explained by industrial capacity, by resources, by the mathematics of attrition. But this watching women soldier with competence required admitting that the ideology itself had been wrong, that limiting women's roles had been a choice, not a biological necessity. That Germany had cut its own potential in half by insisting that half the population remain in subordinate positions regardless of talent or inclination. The training continued for 3 weeks. The German prisoners progressed from dry firing to live ammunition, from stationary targets to basic field exercises. Captain Hetherington pushed them through the same curriculum she used for WAC recruits, making no accommodations for their prisoner status beyond the obvious security precautions. They learned to field strip the Garand, to clear malfunctions, to estimate range and adjust for wind. They learned the difference between cover and concealment, between suppressive fire and end shots, between shooting at paper and understanding that paper was a substitute for flesh. Some of the women struggled. Gisela Hoffmann, a former telephone operator from Munich, flinched every time she pulled the trigger, her shots scattering wide as her body anticipated recoil and overcorrected. Others took to it with disturbing ease. Erika Schudder, who had worked in a radar station in Holland, proved to have a natural gift for marksmanship. Her shots grouping so tightly at center mass that Captain Hetherington had to check the target to confirm it wasn't TA malfunction. Erika's expression while shooting was one of intense concentration, her face emptied of emotion, her breathing controlled, her world narrowed to the mechanics of accuracy. "You're good at this," Susan Kowalski told her after a particularly impressive string of shots. "You have steady hands." Erika lowered her rifle, smoke still curling from the barrel. "I am good at following instructions," she said through Emma's translation. "That is what we were trained for. To follow instructions precisely. To do our jobs without question. That skill transfers." "There's more to it than that," Susan insisted. "You have to want to hit the target. You have to care about accuracy. Following instructions gets you the basics, but precision comes from somewhere else." "Where?" Erika asked, genuinely curious. Susan thought about it. Pride, maybe, or just the satisfaction of doing something well. "I don't know. I grew up shooting cans off fence posts with my dad. It was a game. Then it became competition at school. Then the army. It's always been about trying to be better than I was yesterday. That's not ideology. That's just human." Erika looked at the target downrange, at the cluster of holes she had punched through the paper silhouette center mass. "In Germany, we were told that competition between women was unnatural, that cooperation was feminine, that individual achievement was a masculine trait. But I like this. Shooting. I like being good at it. I like that I can measure my improvement. Does that make me masculine? No," Susan said firmly. "It makes you human, same as me. Same as anyone who wants to get better at something they care about. The whole masculine-feminine thing is it's just a story people tell, to keep things organized a certain way. It's not real. What's real is whether you can hit what you aim at." The rifle became the symbolic object around which the entire experience revolved, the physical manifestation of American philosophy made tangible. It was not the most powerful weapon in the American arsenal. Tanks and bombers held that distinction, but it was the most personal, the most democratic. Every American soldier, regardless of rank or specialty, received basic rifle training. Every citizen, in theory, had the right to own firearms. The weapon represented individual capability, the idea that power should be distributed rather than concentrated, that competence with tools of violence was a civic virtue, rather than the exclusive province of a warrior class. For the German prisoners, this was a profound philosophical departure from their own experience. Germany had strict gun control laws dating back to the Weimar Republic, laws that the Nazis had selectively enforced to disarm potential enemies while arming party loyalists. Weapons had been symbols of state authority, controlled and distributed according to ideological considerations. The idea that ordinary American women could not only access firearms, but be systematically trained in their use by the military itself represented a vision of citizenship that was alien and, in its way, terrifying. If women could shoot, what else? Had been a lie. If competence was not gendered, What other limitations were artificial? If American women could learn in 3 weeks what German women had been told they were biologically incapable of, what did that say about the entire edifice of National Socialist ideology? The final test came on August 3, 1945. The German prisoners would fire for qualification, the same standard that WAC recruits had to meet to pass basic training. 40 rounds at targets ranging from 100 to 300 yards, scored for accuracy, time, and consistency. It was not a combat simulation. Those were reserved for troops deploying to active theaters, but it was a legitimate measurement of marksmanship skills. Captain Hetherington briefed them the night before. "This is not a competition between you and us," she said through Emma's translation. "This is about you and the target, about what you have learned. Some of you will qualify. Some of you will not. Either way, you will know what you are capable of when given the opportunity to learn. That knowledge is worth something, regardless of the score." The morning of the qualification, the prisoners assembled at the range with an anticipation that surprised them. They had not expected to care about performance. They had not expected to have any investment in the outcome. And yet, standing at the firing line with loaded rifles, they discovered that they wanted to succeed, wanted to demonstrate competence, wanted to prove if only to themselves that they were capable of this thing that they had been told was impossible for women. Hild Engel fired her 40 rounds with methodical precision. She did not achieve the highest score among the prisoners, but she qualified, hitting 32 of her 40 targets, a respectable showing for someone who had never touched a firearm before July. When she finished, she stood at the firing line, with the rifle still pressed to her shoulder, looking downrange at the paper targets that fluttered in the Iowa wind. And she felt something she had not experienced since before the war: pride in her own capability, unmediated by ideology, unfiltered through the lens of service to something larger. She had learned to shoot. She was competent. That was enough. Erica should have scored 38 out of 40. A performance that would have qualified her as an expert marksman by Army standards. Captain Hetherington walked up to her after the scoring was complete, took the rifle, and looked at the target sheets with an expression of professional respect. "If you were American," Hetherington said, "I'd try to recruit you as an instructor. You have a gift for this." Erica smiled, a rare expression on a face that usually remained carefully neutral. "If I were American," she replied through Emma, "perhaps I would have learned this years ago. Perhaps many things would have been different." News of the Japanese surrender reached Fort Des Moines on August 15, 1945. The war was over. Completely, finally, irrevocably over. In the barracks, American WAC members celebrated with cautious jubilation, aware that victory had been purchased with hundreds of thousands of lives. That Japan's surrender followed atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That the world had changed in ways both exhilarating and terrifying. In the prisoner compound, the German women sat in silence, processing information that confirmed what they already knew but had not fully accepted. They had lost everything. Germany was occupied, divided between Soviet and Western zones. The Reich was gone. Home was a concept without clear geographical reference. Hild Engel sat on her bunk, cleaning the rifle she had been issued for training. The mechanical ritual of maintenance comforting in its simplicity. She ran the cleaning rod through the barrel, watching the patches come out progressively cleaner, the smell of gun oil sharp and almost pleasant. Around her, other women performed the same task. 37 prisoners caring for weapons they would soon return, weapons they would likely never touch again, weapons that had become, temporarily, symbols of their own capacity. Emma Rothstein entered the barracks, her expression complex. "You will be returning the rifles tomorrow," she announced in German. "The training is complete. Arrangements are being made for your repatriation to Germany. It will take months, maybe longer, But eventually, you will go home, home, Hild repeated. The word tasting strange. What is there to go home? Emma had no easy answer. She had seen the intelligence reports, the photographs of German cities reduced to geometric abstractions of rubble. Whatever is left, she said finally. And what you build from it? Will we be allowed to tell people what happened here? Erica asked. That American women taught us to shoot, that we learned what our own military said we could not learn. I don't see why not, Emma replied. It's the truth, though I suspect not everyone will believe it. People have trouble accepting truths that contradict their beliefs. Easier to dismiss the evidence than to revise the ideology. Will it matter? Another prisoner asked. A young woman named Lot, who had worked in a Berlin communications center and had barely spoken during the entire 3 weeks of training. What we learned here, will it change anything? Emma considered this. I don't know, she admitted. Maybe not immediately, but knowledge has a way of spreading. You will remember that you were capable of this. You will tell your daughters, perhaps, or your sisters. They will tell others. And slowly, over years, the idea that women cannot do these things will erode, not because of grand political declarations, but because of accumulated evidence. You are part of that evidence now. The rifles were returned on August 16th. The German prisoners formed a line, each woman handing her weapon to a WAC corporal, who checked the serial number, confirmed proper maintenance, and secured it in the armory. It was a ritual of divestment, the surrender of temporary power, the return to prisoner status after 3 weeks of being, in some limited sense, soldiers. Hild handed her rifle to Susan Kowalski, who had been her training partner throughout. Susan took it, checked it, nodded approval. You did good, Susan said. Better than a lot of the recruits who come through here. You should be proud. I am, Hild admitted, though I am not certain what I am proud of. I learned to shoot. What use is that to me now? Susan smiled slightly. Maybe no use at all. Or maybe it's the thing that reminds you that you're more capable than you thought. That's worth something, even if you never touch a rifle again. Knowing what you can do that stays with you. Is that why you do it? Hild asked. Teach shooting. To show women what they can do. Partly, Susan said. Also because it's my job, and I'm good at it, and the army needs instructors. But yeah. There's satisfaction in watching someone discover they can do something they thought was impossible. You see it in their faces, the moment when they realize the only thing stopping them before was the belief that they couldn't. That's a good moment. I like being part of that. Hild nodded slowly. Thank you, she said, in careful English, her first attempt at the language, for teaching. Susan's smile widened. You're welcome. And hey, when you get back to Germany, remember this. You qualified with an M1 Garand. Not many people can say that. Not many men, even, hold on to that. The repatriation process began in November 1945. The German prisoners were transported east in stages, through camps and processing centers. Their numbers gradually diminishing as women were sorted by origin and destination. Hilda Engel ended up in a displaced persons camp outside Frankfurt, waiting for housing allocation in a city where 70% of the buildings had been destroyed. She waited 3 months in a tent camp that smelled of mud and diesel fuel, surrounded by refugees and former soldiers and orphans. Everyone waiting for someone to tell them where they belonged in a Germany that no longer existed. In any form. They recognized that she found work eventually, translating documents for American occupation authorities, her English improving through immersion and necessity. She never told her employers that she had learned to shoot at Fort Des Moines, that American women had taught her to handle a rifle with competence. It seemed irrelevant to the work of translation, to the slow bureaucratic process of rebuilding a nation from rubble and paperwork. But she remembered, on days when the work felt impossible, when the scale of destruction seemed too vast for reconstruction, when the weight of complicity in the Reich's crimes threatened to crush her beneath guilt and shame. She remembered standing at a firing range in Iowa, learning something she had been told was impossible, discovering that competence was not gendered, that capability could be taught, that the limitations she had accepted as natural had been lies, designed to keep her useful but not threatening. The rifle had been a symbol, but symbols have power. The M1 Garand represented democratic violence, the idea that power should be distributed, that citizens should be capable, that competence was a civic virtue, rather than a threat to order. Learning to shoot had not made Hild violent. It had made her confident. It had shown her that she could learn difficult things, that physical challenges were not beyond her, that the only real limitation was opportunity and training. In 1948, 3 years after her return to Germany, Hild Engel stood in the ruins of what had been her family's home in Frankfurt, salvaging bricks from the rubble for reuse in reconstruction. The city was slowly rebuilding, block by block, the Marshall Plan pouring American dollars into European recovery. The same abundance that had fed prisoners now feeding reconstruction around her. Other women worked with the same methodical determination, clearing debris, sorting materials, building forms for concrete, doing the physical labor that no one had told them they were incapable of because necessity had overruled ideology. A younger woman working nearby, 18 or 19, struggling, with a wheelbarrow full of broken concrete, paused to rest. "They say women in America do all sorts of work," she commented to Hild, "that they were soldiers during the war. Do you think that's true, or just propaganda?" Hild set down the brick she had been carrying. She looked at the girl, at her youth, at the future she represented. "It is true," she said quietly. "I saw it myself. American women soldier. They trained me to shoot, in a prisoner camp in Iowa. They were as competent as any man I ever served with, more competent than many." The girl stared at her. "You can shoot." "I could," Hild said. "I have not touched a rifle in 3 years, but yes, I learned. And it was not difficult. It was simply training, practice, patience, the same as any other skill." "Why did they teach you? You were their prisoner." "I think," Hild said slowly, working through the answer even as she spoke it, "because they wanted us to understand that the difference between us was not biology. It was opportunity. They had been given opportunities to learn, to develop skills, to demonstrate competence in areas that we had been told were impossible for women. They taught us to prove that those limitations were lies, that we were capable of more than we had been allowed to become." The girl considered this. Then she picked up her wheelbarrow and pushed it toward the debris pile, her movements more confident, as if the simple knowledge that other women had done difficult things made her own labor feel less impossible. Hild watched her go, thinking about symbols and rifles, about the weight of an M1 Garand and the weight of ideology, about what it meant to learn that you were capable of things you had been told were beyond you. The rifle itself was gone, returned to an American armory, probably issued to another soldier, probably crossed the Pacific to fight in Japan. But the knowledge remained, the confidence remained, the understanding that limitations could be artificial, that capability could be learned, that the world was larger and stranger than propaganda allowed. By the 1950s, the story of German women, prisoners learning to shoot at Fort Des Moines, had become one of those odd historical footnotes that occasionally surfaced in memoirs and academic papers, mentioned briefly, and then passed over in favor of larger narratives about Reconstruction and the Cold War. Most of the women who had participated never spoke of it publicly. It did not fit easily into either German or American narratives of the post-war period. For Germans, it was complicated by the shame of defeat and the horror of discovering the full extent of Nazi atrocities. For Americans, it raised uncomfortable questions about why women's military roles remained limited even after they had proven their capability. But in private conversations, in letters between women who had shared that experience, in the quiet transmission of knowledge from mothers To daughters, the story persisted, not as propaganda, not as ideology, but as simple fact. We learned to shoot, we were good at it. We discovered that we were capable of more than we had been told. This was the subtle revolution that Fort Des Moines represented, not a dramatic overthrow of gender norms, but a quiet accumulation of evidence that those norms were arbitrary, that capability was not bounded by biology, that the only real limitations were the ones enforced by law and custom and belief. The women who learned to shoot in Iowa in 1945 carried that knowledge back to a Germany that would spend the next decade slowly, painfully, reconstructing not just its cities, but its understanding of itself, of what was possible, of who could do what. The M1 Garand was eventually replaced by more modern weapons, the M14, then the M16. The evolution of military technology moving forward with the same inevitability that had characterized American industrial production during the war. But the principle it represented remained constant, that power should be distributed, that citizens should be capable, that competence with tools of violence was a democratic virtue rather than an aristocratic privilege. The women of Fort Des Moines understood this in a way that transcended politics or ideology. They understood it in their bodies, in the muscle memory of proper stance and sight picture, in the satisfaction of hitting what you aimed at, in the simple confidence that comes from knowing you can do a difficult thing well. They had been told they were incapable. They had learned otherwise. That knowledge, once gained, could not be unlearned. And so the rifle became more than a weapon. It became proof, evidence, a symbol of the gap between what ideology claimed and what reality demonstrated. It represented the difference between a system that limited women's roles based on assumptions about biology and a system that, however imperfectly, allowed women to demonstrate capability and then adjusted roles accordingly. Neither system was perfect. Both had limitations and injustices, but one had shown flexibility that the other had not, had created space for women to prove themselves in ways that German ideology had foreclosed as impossible. In 1963, Hilde Engels sat in her small apartment in Frankfurt, now a translator for an international business firm, watching television coverage of American women protesting for equal rights. The images were grainy, black and white, but the determination on the women's faces was unmistakable. They carried signs demanding equal pay, equal opportunity, equal treatment under law. They were arguing for things that seemed, to Hilde's generation, almost unimaginably distant from the realities of 1945, when simply surviving had been achievement enough. But she remembered Iowa. She remembered Susan Kowalski teaching her to shoot. She remembered the casual competence of American women soldiers, the way they had handled weapons with the same professionalism that German ideology had insisted was impossible for women. She remembered discovering that the limitations she had accepted as natural were artificial, that competence could be learned, that the only real barrier was opportunity. The protesters on television were demanding opportunity. They were insisting that barriers be removed, that assumptions be questioned, that women be allowed to demonstrate capability, rather than being limited by presumption. Hilde understood, in a way that perhaps only someone who had lived through the demolition of one ideology and the construction of another could understand, that they were right. Not because biology was irrelevant, it clearly imposed some constraints, but because most of the limitations that societies placed on women had nothing to do with biology and everything to do with maintaining existing power structures. She thought about writing a letter to one of the American newspapers, about sharing her story of learning to shoot at Fort Des Moines, about offering her experience as evidence that women had been capable of these things all along, that the only thing that had changed was permission and opportunity. But she did not write the letter. She was not sure anyone would care about the experiences of a former German prisoner, not sure that her testimony would carry weight in debates about American society. Instead, she simply remembered. And when younger women in her office asked her about the war, about what it had been like, about how Germany had changed, she told them about Iowa, about American women soldiers, about learning to shoot a rifle she had been told she could never master. She told them that the difference between capable and incapable was often just training and opportunity, that limitations were frequently artificial, that the world was larger and stranger than ideology allowed. And sometimes the young women listened, and sometimes they remembered, and slowly, across decades, the accumulated weight of such memories shifted what people believed was possible. The rifle in the end was not about violence. It was about proof. It was physical evidence that contradicted ideology, that made certain claims about women's natural limitations impossible to sustain in the face of demonstrated competence. You could argue about theory, about biology, about proper social roles, but you could not argue with a target full of holes placed there by a woman who had been told shooting was beyond her capability. This was the democratic promise that America represented, however imperfectly realized, that capability would be recognized, that competence would be rewarded, that assumptions would yield to evidence. It was a promise frequently broken, often honored more in rhetoric than reality, but it was also a promise that created space for change, that made argument possible, that allowed women like Susan Kowalski to become firearms instructors and women like Hilde Engel to discover they were capable of more than ideology allowed. The German prisoners who learned to shoot at Fort Des Moines in the summer of 1945 carried that knowledge home with them, a seed planted in the rubble of the Reich, waiting for conditions that would allow it to grow. Some of them told their daughters, some of them kept it private. A personal memory of a time when the world had been larger than they expected. All of them remembered that moment when assumption met reality, and reality won, when they discovered that the rifle was not too heavy, the recoil not too strong, the skill not too difficult. The only real barrier having been the belief that barriers existed. And in that memory lay a truth larger than any single experience, that human capability is vast and varied, that most limitations are artificial, that the stories societies tell about who can do what are often just stories, maintained through repetition rather than evidence, sustained by power rather than truth. The women of Fort Des Moines learned to shoot. They learned other things too about America, about themselves, about the difference between ideology and reality. But the shooting was the symbol, the concrete demonstration, the thing that could not be explained away or dismissed as misunderstanding. They learned to shoot. And, in learning, they proved that they always could have. They just needed someone to hand them a rifle and teach them how.